Hello everybody, and welcome to Hampstead Garden Suburb U3A. Are you in the right place? Good. Today I have the pleasure of introducing Robin Lustig to you. Robin is an award-winning journalist and broadcaster, and today he's going to be discussing his new book, And the Cello Came Too, in which he tells a story of his German Jewish family, starting with his earliest ancestry in 14th century Nuremberg, taking in rabbis and scholars in the 19th century, their persecution under Nazis, and the family's eventual rebirth after the Second World War. Now, who is Robin? Robin began his journalist career with Reuters News Agency, then spent 12 years at The Observer before joining the BBC in 1989. He presented The World Tonight on Radio 4 for more than 20 years and received the Charles Wheeler Award for Outstanding Contribution to Broadcast Journalism in 2013. His first book, Is Anything Happening?, was published in 2017. And when I asked Robin, did he enjoy writing his book? You said yes. And how long did it take? I think you said about 18 months. And did he have to go off to a retreat in order to write it? He said, no, I can write it very easily from home. May I present Robin Lustig?
Thank you, Carol. Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to see you all here. I was very relieved when it stopped raining an hour or so ago. I was convinced this morning that nobody would turn up. Anyway, it's lovely to see you all here and to have a chance to tell you a little bit about this book, only just published a week ago, so fresh, hot off the press. As Carol said, it is a family history, and I think probably the first thing I need to do is explain or justify why I felt it was a story worth telling. We all, after all, have family histories. I'm a great believer in the value of family histories. But the short answer to why I wrote the book is that when my father died in 2017, I inherited a huge amount of material from him, box loads, in fact, of letters, photographs, documents, but most valuable of all, a memoir that he had written, a memoir that his father had written, a memoir that my uncle, my father's brother, had written, and a diary that my mother had kept for much of the Second World War. So I had this treasure trove of material. As Carol said, I'm a journalist. I've been a journalist all my adult life. And I said to myself, if I can't find some decent stories in all this material, I've got no right to call myself a journalist. There must be a story worth telling. Now, I knew some of the story, of course, because both of my parents had come to this country as refugees from Nazi Germany in 1939. And I knew that story, and I knew what it was part of. And I am a great believer in the value of telling the story of that terrible period in European history as often as we can, and making sure that people don't have a chance to forget it. I also decided that all this material that I had stored in boxes was very unlikely to be read by succeeding generations of my family. My two children certainly hadn't read it, and I now have two grandchildren, and I thought I owe it to them to give them the opportunity to learn something of their family story without having to plough through tons and tons of, let's be honest, fairly indigestible material. So I sat down to try to create something a little bit more digestible. But there was another reason as well why I felt it was worth writing, and what I'm going to do this afternoon, with your permission, is just read you a few extracts from the book to give you a flavour of what's in it. And so right at the beginning, I explained for my readers why I think it is of some value. So let me just read you what I wrote on this particular part of the story. I said, the Irish novelist Paul Lynch, in his novel Prophet Song, which won the 2023 Booker Prize, wrote, and I quote, "History is a silent record of people who did not know when to leave. Fortunately for me," I wrote, "most members of my family did know when to leave Nazi Germany, even if many of them avoided making that decision until the very last moment. Others would dearly have loved to leave, but couldn't. They are the ones who did not survive." In the words of the American journalist and broadcaster Michael Goldfarb, in his book, Emancipation, How Liberating Europe's Jews from the Ghetto Led to Revolution and Renaissance, those of us born after the Holocaust have a responsibility to reclaim and retell one part of the history of our people, not just in honor of those who lived it and were murdered for it, but to help guide us to a renewed understanding of who we are. None of us, I wrote, can escape the past. We are made from cloth woven over the centuries, our genetic makeup determined by all of those who've gone before us. I've long believed that, at least in an ideal world, to truly know ourselves, it helps to know from whom we are descended. None of us is able to answer all the questions that we may have about our genetic history, and in any case, our genes can take us only part of the way towards fully understanding why we are as we are. Nevertheless, I am lucky to have had access to so much of my own family story. This account is my attempt to weave it into a coherent narrative. So there you have my attempt to explain why I wrote the book and why I hope it might be worth other people reading it. I also, I think, need to explain the title of the book, And the Cello Came Too. My father was a cellist. If it hadn't been for the rise of the Nazis in Germany, he probably would have become a professional cellist. He was an extremely talented musician. When he arrived in this country in 1939 at the age of 20, he brought the cello with him. Now, as you all know, the cello is not the most portable of instruments. If he'd been a flautist or a violinist, or as I am, a clarinetist, fine, that would have been no big deal. But to flee one's home country for a foreign land with a cello was no small thing, and it seemed to me somehow to sum up both his devotion to his music and to his instrument, and also his sheer dogged bloody-mindedness that he was not going to leave behind the one thing that he valued almost above all else. So he arrived in Southampton and then by train to Waterloo in April of 1939 with one suitcase and one rather bulky cello. So the cello came too. I'm going to show you just a few slides to give you an idea of what some members of my family actually looked like, so that when I talk about them, you might have some picture of who and what they look, who they were. So that's my father with his cello, aged, I think, 19 or 20, with his father at the piano. My father talked many times about how much he loved the occasions when he and his father played music together. And one of the remarkable things about that particular cello, that's the first full-size cello that my father was given when he was in his mid-teens. And it is the same cello that he played throughout his life. He died at the age of 98, and he was still playing that same cello almost until his dying day. Now that picture is taken just over a year after the first picture I just showed you. It's an army orchestra, a British army orchestra, in which my father is playing the cello. He's the one in the middle there. I'll come on a bit later to explain how it was that he ended up in the British Army and playing his cello in the British Army. That's my grandmother, my father's mother, Rose, the only one of my grandparents whom I knew. All the others died before I was born. She was a lovely, lovely lady, very gracious, piercing blue eyes, and very much the head of the family. She lived almost to 100 and was a very important part of my family as I was growing up. Now that's the other side of my family. That's my mother with her father. She must have been, I think, in her mid-teens. She grew up in Breslau, which is now a Polish city called Wrocław. And that picture, as you can see, was taken outside a photographer's shop, which presumably is the only place where you could get photographs taken like that. She adored her father. He died very young. He died at the age of 50 of a heart attack in 1938. So obviously I never knew him, but I think it's rather a lovely picture. Now that's her mother. That's my maternal grandmother, Ilse, a very elegant woman, as you can see. And if you look at the date of her death, it may suggest to you how she ended her days, and I will give you a little bit more detail about that later on. But a very elegant woman. My mother always described her as somebody who was very, very fashion conscious, who loved good clothes and going out to the opera or to concerts or for dinner parties, and having a very active social life. This chap is included in my little slideshow because I'm rather fond of him. He is my, let me get this right, great-great-great-grandfather, Isaac. I have that portrait hanging in my study. It's a painting. And the reason I'm fond of him is not only I think he looks quite a jovial sort of chap, but he was a wine merchant. Many of my forebears were rather solemn academics and scholars with whom I suspect I wouldn't have had a great deal in common. A wine merchant as a direct ancestor I can relate to, and so I have a particular fondness for him. This is a very different ancestor. He is by far the most eminent of all of the people who make an appearance in my book, Ludwig Philipson. Anybody who knows anything about the history of German Jewry in the 19th century will almost certainly be familiar with his name. He was a rabbi, he was a journalist who founded the main newspaper for German Jews, which he then edited for no less than 50 years. He wasn't a direct ancestor, I have to admit. His younger brother was my great-great-grandfather. So not a direct ancestor at all, but I think he looks very distinguished. He certainly was very distinguished. His older brother was a doctor in Magdeburg, and it is said, I have no idea whether truthfully or not, that at one time Ludwig's brother, the doctor, was called upon to treat the then director of the Magdeburg State Opera, a man by the name of Richard Wagner. Now, I would love that to be true. I can't prove it, of course. Ludwig was called by one historian the most seminal intellectual of German Jewry throughout the better part of the 19th century. And he was a leading voice in the development of liberal Jewish thought. He very much believed in trying to modernize the Jewish religion and Jewish culture. And one of his great contributions to that was to write and publish a German Hebrew dictionary, which became so popular that it was printed in many, many different editions over a period of more than 10 years. It sold more than 100,000 copies, which is almost inconceivable. If I could sell 100th of that number, I'd be thrilled. There is a copy of his dictionary in the Freud Museum in Hampstead. And the reason is that Sigmund Freud was given as a birthday present by his father a copy of Ludwig's dictionary. And indeed, Sigmund Freud wrote about the impact that the dictionary had on his own thinking, because the dictionary included some extraordinary lithographs by a French artist called Gustave Doré, and those photographs apparently figured very prominently in Freud's dreams. And as I'm sure you know, Freud attached a great deal of importance to dreams, and so there's my connection to Sigmund Freud through my not direct ancestor, Ludwig Philipson. This man, Franz, is one of Ludwig's sons. Ludwig had 10 children, 6 sons, 4 daughters. And the reason I put Franz in here is that, as you can probably guess just by looking at him, he actually made a great deal of money. He's the only one of my ancestors whom I know of who became seriously wealthy. And he did it by founding a bank. He moved to Belgium, founded a bank there, and made huge amounts of money. So much so that he was able to arrange the financing of the building of the railway system in what was then the Belgian Congo. He was a devoted imperialist. He was a leading light in what was called the Jewish Colonialist Association, which was a sort of competitor to Herzl's Zionist movement. So while the Zionists were purchasing land in Palestine, Franz and his mates were purchasing land in Argentina and Brazil, huge tracts of land, which they then donated to persecuted Russian Jews, mainly, who were fleeing the Tsarist pogroms and trying to set up new lives for themselves in South America. Usually, it has to be said, without very much success. There are in Argentina and Brazil 2 settlements, or the remains of 2 settlements, called the Colonia Philipson, after him, which were his attempt and his association's attempt to provide new settlements for Jews from Central Europe. That's my dad in 1943. He was now in the British Army. He had left the orchestra, much to his delight, because he didn't much enjoy it, and had joined the Army Intelligence Corps, about which I shall have more to say in a moment. That's my mother, Susan, in the same year, very proudly displaying the 3 stripes on her uniform because she had just been made a sergeant, of which she was extremely proud. And it was while they were both working in the British Army Intelligence Corps that they met and fell in love. And there they are on their wedding day, June the 6th, 1945, 1 year to the day after D-Day. My father had originally said he didn't want any photographs at all taken on his wedding day. He didn't see the need for them. My mother insisted otherwise. She bought a dress in which to get married. He decided his uniform would be perfectly adequate. And so there they are. They married in Hampstead Town Hall, and that is the only picture I have of them on their wedding day. That is them 65 or so years later. That was on my mother's 90th birthday. A very similar pose, in fact. My father, as you can see, is substantially taller than my mother, but they had a long and very happy marriage. So that's just a few pictures of my immediate family. Let me fill in some of the background. My father's family, he grew up in Berlin. He was the youngest of 4 children. He had 2 sisters and 1 brother. He was born just after the First World War. The others had all been born before the First World War, so he was very much the baby of the family. They were a secular, non-observant Jewish family who had pretty much abandoned their Jewish roots, in fact so much so that my father and his 3 siblings were all confirmed into the Lutheran Church, which his parents had thought might ease their way in German society. It might have done had it not been for the rise of the Nazis. They were a middle-class family. They lived a fairly comfortable life until the economic collapse of Germany in the aftermath of the First World War, when my grandfather's business collapsed and he earned scraped a living, I should say, as a traveling salesman representing the manufacturers of bicycles. They had just enough to live on. My father always used to say that his father never took a holiday. The other members of the family would go off into the mountains for the summer, but leave Franz, his father, behind. It was a very happy family by all accounts. One sister went off to Portugal as a gymnastics teacher. My uncle, my father's older brother, was very, very politically active on the left. He got involved in all kinds of scrapes, fighting against the fascists. He studied law, but then after the Nazis introduced the so-called Nuremberg laws, which banned Jews from any kind of professional activity, it became clear that he was not going to be allowed to practice law. So he decided to emigrate, which he did, to the United States. And he spent the rest of his adult life in America. I have 3 cousins in the US of whom I'm very fond. And so there is an American branch of the Lustig family. My mother's family, as I say, she was born and grew up in Breslau. She was an only child. Her parents, also middle class. Her father, also a failed businessman, also ended up as a traveling salesman, in his case not representing the manufacturers of bicycles, but the manufacturers of dental equipment, which enabled him to scrape a living. He, as I say, died very young, at the age of 50, of a heart attack, leaving my mother and her mother on their own, impoverished and very frightened, because very soon after her father died came Kristallnacht, the pogrom of November 1938, when it became clear that my mother, who was then about 18, would have no future. She'd had a very unhappy adolescence. She'd been thrown out of the school in which she had been behaving rather badly by all accounts and not doing at all well. So she also had to leave. My father arrived in this country in April of 1939. He finally got a visa to come to this country on 2 conditions. The first condition was that he would enroll as a builder's apprentice, and the second condition was that he would leave within 12 months for one of the so-called British dominions, either Canada or Australia. As it happened, within months of his arrival here, the Second World War broke out, and the chances of leaving the country diminished to the point of having vanished, and so he didn't leave. He used to describe himself as one of the first overstayers in British immigration history. His arrival here in 1939 was not the first time he'd been in this country. He'd actually come here on a summer holiday in 1936 in order to improve his knowledge of the English language, because even then he and his family had realized that it was going to be useful for him to be able to speak English well. And he, after spending, I think, 6 weeks in this country as a teenage schoolboy, he wrote a wonderful, lengthy essay, about 4,000-word essay, describing his impressions of England during that visit. And to my great delight, he translated that in later life into English, and so I have it. and I was able to quote for it in the book. But there was also a story which I thought was worth retelling from that holiday that he spent here. So let me just read you a little account of his experience at that time. Letchworth was built in the early 20th century as England's first garden city. The idea was to build a town that could provide good jobs and high-quality housing while retaining all the benefits of life in the countryside. Many of the original houses built in the arts and crafts style, rough cast white exterior walls, red roof tiles, country cottage-style windows, still exist. And when I visited Norton Way North in March of 2024, many of the houses looked as if they had barely changed since Fritz's visit nearly 88 years earlier. Just around the corner, at the end of Neville's Road, stands the imposing red brick factory that once was the UK home of the American Spirella Company, manufacturer of women's underwear. For poor Fritz, it is the cause of great embarrassment as he's shown around the town. "What is this place?" he asks the teenage daughter of the family who were hosting him and the friend that she had brought with her. Amid much giggling, they tell him it's where they make bras. Bras? What are bras? Brassieres. More giggles, but Fritz is none the wiser. It is not a word that has come up in his English language lessons at school. Joan's friend saves the day. Her dad works for Spirella, and the family has spent some time in Germany. Bustenhalter, she clarifies, and now at last Fritz understands. If he had returned after the outbreak of the Second World War, there would have been no more cause for embarrassment. Spirella had switched to making parachutes. He was very fond of the family that he stayed with at that time, the Francis family. I'm still in touch with some of the grandchildren. And a little footnote to history, the youngest daughter of the family, who was then, I think, only 5 or 6 years old, was very much enamored of this rather good-looking teenage visitor in their home and asked him to start teaching her the cello. She actually became a professional cellist. Her son became a professional cellist. And so the cello of my book's title, again, carried on down through the ages. The other thing that my father left behind from that visit were his impressions of British mores, British habits, what we might even call British culture. And I thought it might just be worth reading a little bit of that. This is what he had to say about British manners. The politeness of English people is well known, and rightly so. Of course, they're especially friendly towards foreigners. Hardly have you uttered 2 sentences, and they will comment on your marvellous English. You're very proud about that, but after you've heard it too many times, you get a bit suspicious about whether it is their real opinion. This politeness is also noticeable on public notices. Please keep off the grass. Please do not smoke. The word prohibited is used only in very rare cases. And then on honesty, he has this to say: it is gratifying how much one can trust the honesty of others. You can leave your bicycle in the street for hours without worrying about it, and people don't mind leaving their doors unlocked. I saw how during the open-air performance of a school play, the school's library, which was on the ground floor, was left unlocked. No one was worried that a stranger might enter the library and look at the books. Nobody worries that somebody might walk off with something that does not belong to them. These are the impressions of a probably quite naive 16-year-old schoolboy coming from Nazi Germany and experiencing a very different society and a very different atmosphere in England of the mid-30s. When he left Germany in 1939 as a 20-year-old, he was a lot less naive. He knew what was happening, and he knew the enormity of the step that he was taking. And when he wrote his memoir in his old age, he recalled his feelings as he left Germany in April of 1939. Some thoughts ran through my mind which at the time I considered quite profound. I was leaving the country in which I'd been born, where my home had been, where I'd gone to school, but leaving it with very few regrets, because it had become a prison, and I was now on my way to freedom. But I was also apprehensive, as the future was so uncertain. I was pretty sure that I would never return to Germany. The Third Reich seemed so firmly established that no one, at least in Germany, could imagine that a mere 6 years later it would have disappeared. The likelihood of war and the possibility that it might entail a German defeat was very far from my mind. Those were his thoughts as he left Germany. My mother left in very different circumstances. She left even later, in July of 1939, so a matter of only weeks before the Second World War began. She had hoped that she and her mother would be able to emigrate together to the United States, where one of her mother's brothers was living in Chicago. But as I'm sure you know, the Americans, like many other countries, had a very strict quota on how many refugees that they would accept at any one time. And so they also, my mother and her mother, applied for visas to this country. My mother's visa came through, her mother's did not. I mentioned that my father had been allowed here on 2 conditions: that he signed up as a builder's apprentice and that he would agree to leave within 12 months. The condition that my mother had to fulfill when her visa was granted was that if she took a job, it could only be as a domestic servant. And I still have in a desk drawer at home her German Nazi passport and the stamp in it, which was put there when she arrived in Southampton in July 1939, which says, in terms, allowed only to take employment as a servant in a domestic household. So that is what she did. She lived for the first years of the war in Finchley, not a couple of miles from here, with a Breslau-born dentist. She was a combination of domestic servant, as per her visa condition, but also trained as a dental assistant, and was not very happy, it has to be said. From her diary, it's quite clear that she felt very, very worried about her mother, whom she had left behind, and very uncertain about what her future would be. Eventually, in 1943, she joined the British Army. She'd been given a choice of either going to work in a munitions factory or joining the army. She decided joining the army sounded like it would be more interesting. And very soon thereafter, she was spotted as somebody who might be useful in the British Army Intelligence Corps, because, of course, as a native German speaker, she would be a useful translator. My father had also been recruited into the Intelligence Corps for similar reasons. I don't know how many of you are familiar with a unit which until quite recently was very, very secret, called the Secret Listeners. What they did was eavesdrop on the bugged conversations of German prisoners of war who were being held in prison camps in this country. And the reason was actually fairly straightforward. It was thought, rightly as it turned out, that German POWs would speak to each other much more frankly and openly than they would be prepared to speak to their British Army interrogators, who wanted to know about German military activities. And so my father and a group of about 100 other, almost entirely German and Austrian refugees, were recruited into the British Army to eavesdrop on these bugged prison conversations, record them if they were of some interest, transcribe them and translate them, and feed them into the sort of intelligence machine which helped the British and the Allies eventually to win the war. And it was while my father and my mother were both working in that unit at Latimer House in Buckinghamshire, not all that far from here, that they met and fell in love. One of the things that emerges from my mother's diaries of that period is how even during war, even at the height of the Blitz, for example, it was possible to have fun, to live a life, to go to the cinema, to go to dances, to meet boys, and do all of the things which young people do, war or no war. And I make the point in my book that I think of her and what she reveals in her diary when I read of the bombing raids on Kiev in Ukraine, or the appalling events in Gaza, or in Tehran, or wherever there is war now. And I think of people, just as my mother was during the Second World War, still trying to make a life for themselves, still trying to live a life despite everything that was going on. One of the darkest parts of my mother's life at that time, of course, was the uncertainty over what was happening to her mother. There was very little communication between the UK and Germany at that time, and she had very little information coming from her mother, and it eventually stopped. In the diary, she often says how worried she is. She talks about spending time in tears, sometimes thinking of her mother, on her mother's birthday, for example, which also happens to be my birthday. And it wasn't until after the war was over, in 1947, that she eventually learnt what had happened to her mother. I'm not going to dwell on it here because it's an awful story. If you want it, it's in the book, but her mother was arrested by the Gestapo in November of 1941. She was deported to Lithuania and she was shot. She was one of thousands and thousands and thousands of German Jews and indeed Lithuanian Jews who were shot during that period. And there's a chapter in the book in which I talk in some detail about the SS commander in charge of the execution squad, which was responsible for my grandmother's death, because I became, I suppose I have to be honest, I became obsessed with trying to work out what kind of a man could command a unit which, by his own account, was responsible for the deaths of nearly 140,000 people in just under 6 months. It was known, as you may know, as the Holocaust of bullets, because between 1.5 and 2 million people were killed before the Nazis embarked on their program of mass extermination by gas chamber. I don't want to say too much more about what's in the book, because of course I want you to buy the book and read it for yourselves, but just in the last couple of minutes available, I want first of all to explain why I call it a story of survival. My family was, by and large, very lucky. Most of them did survive, and as children, my brother and I grew up believing that all of our family survived. What happened to my maternal grandmother was always skated over. My mother wouldn't talk about it. The fact that other, more distant relatives had not survived was also skated over it. I still find it remarkable that my father, when he wrote his memoir, called it a lucky life. Wasn't really all that lucky, except that he survived. My mother, who wrote a much shorter memoir by the expedient of talking to me on tape and then me transcribing it, called her memoir Born Under a Lucky Star. So they were both very positive thinking people. They were both optimists. They both much preferred to look ahead rather than to look back. And it did seem to me always that that was one of the secrets to a happy life, was not to dwell too much on the past. The other part of what I found personally most interesting about researching my family's history and writing the book was trying to delve into a little bit of what was left of their Jewish identity, because the answer was not very much. I didn't have a Jewish upbringing. I wasn't sent to Hebrew school. I didn't have a bar mitzvah. I actually didn't really think I was Jewish until I was well into adulthood, because the labeling of ourselves, the need to adopt an identity, seems to me to be rather a modern phenomenon. And if you'd asked me as a 10 or 11-year-old schoolboy if any of my friends were Jewish, I wouldn't have known the answer, because it wasn't something which I had asked either myself or them. And this isn't actually something which is directly to do with the experience of the Nazi era in Germany. My paternal grandparents, for example, Rose and Franz, who got married in 1903, had a secular wedding. Even at that time, they had abandoned any kind of religious identity. And the great Ludwig Philippson was a great believer in what he believed was the need for German Jews to be as loyal to their German identity as to their Jewish identity. He was a proud German, and he believed his co-religionists should be proud Germans. Both of my grandfathers fought in the German army in the First World War. My mother's father was injured. He had a bullet in his shoulder, which meant that his right arm was useless. My paternal grandfather was actually on the front line in Belgium for part of the First World War, and they were, as I say, loyal Germans. And there's an interesting point made by a historian, let me see if I can find it here, which was that German Jews weren't perhaps so much loyal to the state of Germany as to German culture. My father loved playing Beethoven and Mozart and Schubert, the great German composers. And what my great aunt, who was the family historian before me, wrote was the question is often raised why the Jews in Germany played such an important part in cultural life, comparatively more than in other European countries. If, as I believe, the Philippsons are typical of a certain section of German Jewish society, it seems that some elements in 19th century German mentality and social structure made it easier for Jews to become absorbed in cultural life than elsewhere. They did quite well, my German Jewish forebears, between the mid-19th century and the mid-20th century. It all changed, of course, in 1933 when the Nazis came to power. And when I think of my parents as refugees, and I think of the way in which the word refugee has now become part of our everyday political and journalistic lexicon, I see a relationship between my parents' experiences and the experiences of refugees coming to this country now. And when I see the pictures of young men scrambling ashore from these flimsy rubber dinghies having crossed the channel in very dangerous circumstances, I can't help asking myself how many of them will actually get the chance to live long and fulfilling lives in the way that my parents and the rest of my family did. And so I think there is a sort of contemporary relevance to the story that I tell in this book, which I hope that some people who read it will take away with them and then perhaps think a little bit differently about the refugees coming to these shores now, if they realize how many of the refugees of previous eras did go on to live useful lives in this country. I'll finish there because I know some of you will have questions. I think there is a microphone which might be available for you. I should warn you, I'm quite hard of hearing, so you might have to shout. But thank you for your attention. Thank you for coming along and ask your questions.
That was wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Engaging, personable. I feel like I've been down memory lane in your family. I feel like I should become one of your slides. It was just so engaging. It really just captured the imagination. Certainly the book is here for you to buy if you'd like to, but really thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure, thanks.
Right, any questions please from the audience? Question, right, okay, I'm on my way.
Thank you very much, that was wonderful. What I'm really interested in is to know what you're going to do with all the papers, because I'm a historian and I live in archives. So are you going to keep these, or are you going to deposit them somewhere, and if so, where?
It's a very good question, because one of the big problems I encountered when I embarked on this project was that I don't speak German. And of course, nearly all of the material that I inherited was in German. My father, bless him, had translated my mother's diary, his own writings from the 1930s, his father's memoir, which is a tome about this thick. I discovered that at my old university, the University of Sussex, there is an Institute of German Jewish Studies, and there in their archive now resides boxes of my family stuff. I hope one day a PhD student will stumble across it and do something with it, but it's sitting there. It's not going to go to waste.
I know I have a box of pictures in my loft, and they're just pictures, but they are pictures of the family. So it takes somebody like yourself to go through those and try and piece all of those together.
Can I make a plea to anybody who has boxes of old family photographs? Put the names of who they are on the back.
If we know. If we know.
Or if you have relatives who know. Not only did my father translate a lot of family material, for which I am eternally grateful, he did go through the photographs and where he could put names on them. So I have been able to construct a family tree with photographs. I've got more than 900 names on that family tree. It is worth doing, and nobody else can do it if you don't do it.
That's right, nobody else can. Right, question.
Where does the name Philipson come from? Because it's
son
not...
of Philip.
Sorry?
The son of Philip. Yes, I know. The first Philipson in this branch of the family, it's not an uncommon name, was Moses Philipson in the early 18th century, whose father was Philip Ansvalt, and he then called himself Philipson. The cabinet minister, Bridget Philipson, the education secretary, spells her name with 2 L's and 1 P. My family spell it with 1 L and 2 P's, but my father's mother was a Philipson, and so that's where that branch of the family came.
Okay, another question, right.
Were you able to establish why your mother was given a visa and your grandmother not?
The reason is very simple and very shocking. Her mother, who in 1939 was 41 years old, was deemed to be too old to work either as a nurse or as a domestic servant, which were the only 2 categories of employment that female Jewish refugees were allowed to take. So her fate was sealed by the fact that at the age of 41, she was deemed too old.
More questions?
Did your family discuss the Holocaust during your childhood? They were pretty directly affected by it, but it was not a subject of great discussion in my family. They were interested in Israel, but not very interested in the Holocaust. They knew about it, but it wasn't talked about as much as it is now.
I think that's probably true. I can remember when I was at school, I spent a lot of time in the school library, and I found some books about the Second World War and about the Holocaust, and I devoured them. I knew that my family had been affected by it. I knew why my parents had had to leave Germany. I didn't, of course, know the full horror. One of the great achievements, it seems to me, of my parents was that they were able somehow to tell us what they believed we needed to know about their own background without terrifying us or without giving us nightmares, without traumatizing us. There is, as I'm sure you know, a phenomenon known as second-generation Holocaust survivors. I don't regard myself as a second-generation Holocaust survivor because it was not part of my conscious childhood. I learnt about it gradually over years, and I'm still learning about it. I mean, I've learned a huge amount writing this book, and one of the frustrating things about writing a book is that you keep learning stuff even after it's been printed. And even to this day, I'm coming across new information which I would love to have been able to include. So if ever there's a second edition, it'll be just a little bit fatter than this one is now.
What would you say, Robin, was the learning for you as a person? What did you learn by writing the book?
I learnt a great deal about my maternal grandmother's fate, which, as I mentioned, my mother didn't like talking about, didn't want to talk about. One of the first things I did after my mother died was to go to her hometown, to what was Breslau. She would never dream of going. I've been back to Berlin with my father, but my mother would never do it. So I did that. I went to the site in Lithuania where my grandmother died, because I wanted to do that. One of the things about being a journalist is you want to see for yourself, and you want to bear witness, and so I very much did that. I learnt literally as this book was going to press that while my father was interned on the Isle of Man, something that I skipped over in my earlier remarks, because he only spent a few weeks, fortunately, as an internee. While he was there, the great composer Vaughan Williams wrote a letter asking whether my father was a sufficiently eminent musician to warrant him being released early, because there was a Home Office program. They somehow seemed to be embarrassed by the fact that some of the Jewish refugees whom they rounded up were actually very talented artists and musicians, and they thought they probably needed to release them from behind barbed wire. And so this letter was brought to my attention by an academic just a matter of a couple of months ago. Letter from Vaughan Williams asking about my father. If my father had known about that, he would have been absolutely gobsmacked. But I managed to squeeze it into the book. There's a little paragraph.
What was the catalyst that made you want to write the book? Was there did you wake up one morning thinking, I've just got to write this, or not?
I mean, partly, as I say, just the knowledge that I had all this material and I needed to do something with it. Partly the fact that I knew that my grandchildren would never plough through all that stuff. And also, you know, I'm a journalist. I like finding stuff out and writing about it.
You said that you enjoyed writing it. What did you so enjoy about that?
I like telling stories. I like passing on knowledge to other people. And I hope that if some of you get the chance to read the book, you'll find it accessible. It's not a difficult read, I hope, because one of my aims was to make it, as I say, accessible. Somebody asked me at an earlier event last week, he said he had a 200,000 word account of, I think he said, his mother's life. And, you know, how could he narrow it down? And I said, just tell the interesting bits. But it's easier for a journalist.
And when it came to the end, was there something that did you ever say to yourself, I could have done this differently?
Would I have done differently? It's very difficult to say. I read other people's family histories while I was working on mine. Some of you may have read Daniel Finkelstein's book, Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad. Yeah. Wonderful, wonderful book, which I thought, you know, if I can do something like that, it's worth doing. Another former colleague of mine at the BBC, Mashal Hussain, has written a wonderful book about her family history in pre-partition India. There are lots and lots of family histories, and I learned something from each one of them. One of the things I tried to do was relate my family story to the broader political and social context in which they were living.
Robin, thank you. That was a brilliant speech about your family. A few weeks ago, I came across something on the repair shop about a cello that had been refurbished and had come through the Holocaust. Is it the same one, or were there two, except yours
Sorry,
didn't?
say that again.
A few weeks ago on the repair shop, you know, where they take old objects and that means something to the families, there was a cello was brought in that had been through the Holocaust and had come out. And
I saw that, actually, yes.
was it yours?
No. No, I did...
After all that, it wasn't. Where was the other question? Right, okay.
That ties into my question, which is where is the cello now, and is it being played?
Sorry.
Where is the cello now?
The cello
And
is in
it
Cambridge.
being used?
Being used. When my father came to England, Cambridge was the first city he lived in, and so through family connections, the cello is now back in Cambridge, being played in chamber music, just as my father did for decades. And so the last line of the book describes exactly that. And the last line is, "It too has survived," which is remarkable, actually.
Thank you for your talk. I don't know the status of Latimer House, but there is a listeners' museum in Trent Park, which is coming on stream in the next few months.
There is. And my father, at the end of his life, was very involved in the campaign to have that museum set up, even though he himself didn't actually work at Trent Park. There were 3 centres where the secret listeners were based. Latimer House in Buckinghamshire, Wilton Park in Buckinghamshire, and Trent Park, just up at Cockfosters. And Trent Park is now, as you say, the main house. Trent Park House is being developed partly as extremely expensive luxury flats, but also on the ground floor and the basement, a museum devoted in part to the work of the secret listeners. One of the extraordinary parts of this story, sorry, I must stop in a minute, is that until about 20 years ago, nothing was known about the secret listeners. It just wasn't talked about. Everybody working there had signed the Official Secrets Act. They were bound by secrecy. And it was only when a historian by the name of Helen Fry discovered that a lot of the transcripts of the bugged conversations had been declassified and were now open for scholars to examine in the National Archives, that the work that was done there became known. And in his mid to late 90s, my father frequently was interviewed on radio and television because there were very few of them left. I think there were only 2 surviving secret listeners left by the time their work became known, and he was one of them. So he very much revelled in his late life fame. Let me just say, before you all dash off, there are copies of the book available. You can buy one if you wish to.
You beat me to it. How much is it?
Sorry?
How much is the book?
£20.
£20 for the book. If you want to continue the story of the Lustig family, you can do so here. Thank you all so much for coming.